Mr. Gingrey, you have an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk on behalf of Mr. Stearns Amendment number 4.
Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Gentlelady from Colorado reserves a point of order. The amendment is considered as read without objection and will be distributed to the members. In the meantime, Mr. Gingrey will be recognized for 2 minutes to speak in favor of the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. We have heard it mentioned a number of times tonight, objection to certain amendments over concern about slowing the process down. I certainly hope that this fairly simple but important amendment, the majority would agree that this was one that it's worth slowing the process down over. It simply ensures that all applicants for the Medicaid program document their identity to ensure that states are actually implementing this important anti-fraud provision. This amendment prohibits the Secretary from distributing any funds under Section 5001, the temporary increase of Medicaid FMAP, to any state the Secretary finds is not in compliance with this identity verification requirement. Mr. Chairman, in order to encourage states to come back into compliance with this provision, non-compliant states would be given 30 days notice before any funds are withheld, and the states will be allowed to receive Section 5001 funds again as soon as they are found to be in compliance with this provision. This is no small problem, and I think my colleagues would agree with me. A number of states, I could name states, some as much as 10% of Medicaid spending is simply criminally fraudulent. In other states, 3% or more of enrollees in the Medicaid program were determined to be illegal aliens or other non-qualified aliens. So, quite honestly, let's slow down and make sure the verification of Medicaid eligibility is there in this emergency Medicaid program FMAP expansion. That, in essence, is my simple bill, and I hope I'll have support on both sides of the aisle. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Mr. Pallone, recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, this is going to put barriers in the way of a program that we're trying to address quickly. We know that a lot of people are becoming unemployed. The unemployment rates continue. People lose their health coverage as a consequence. And if you start to put these identity barriers in the way, it's going to be more difficult for them and more difficult for states to access the money so that they can provide the coverage. You know, my understanding is that identity is even more difficult to prove than citizenship, and we have an example in one state in Wisconsin, the one state that tracked data. 19,413 people were denied coverage or lost coverage in a 7-month period because they failed to meet the citizenship documentation requirements. These 2/3 actually provided proof of citizenship but not identity. So I mean, at a time when we're really worried about people losing their coverage, and the whole purpose of this is to try to quickly get them insured, I just think that these types of barriers are they're against the whole purpose of the bill.
I wish if the subcommittee chairman would yield for a second.
Sure.
Yeah, I just say to Mr. Pallone, I mean, I know in the state of Georgia, my people would say it'd be cruel and unusual not to identify, and I would hope the people in New Jersey would feel the same way. And it's often, here again, this rush to...
if I could reclaim, it's often difficult for people to, you know, prove their identity. And then the other thing, what I don't understand is that if you use someone else's identity, then you're going to obtain treatment under that person's name and health history. I mean, it seems like who would even want to do that?
Gentleman yield.
Well, very likely somebody who's not eligible.
It's Mr. Pallone's time. In Wisconsin, they tracked the data, and they said 19,413 people were denied coverage or lost their coverage in a 7-month period because they failed to meet the citizenship documentation requirement. And of these, 2/3 actually provided proof of citizenship, but not identity. And I think that your time has expired, but I would join you in opposing the amendment. All time has expired.
I withdraw my reservation.
Gentlelady withdraws her reservation. All time has expired. All those in favor of this amendment say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. The noes have it, and the amendment's not agreed.
Mr. Chairman, on that,
show of hands.
I would respectfully like a recorded vote. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You want a recorded vote?
I do want a recorded vote.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman? Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle votes no. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone, no. Mr. Gordon? Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush, no. Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Stupak? Stupak, no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green? No. Mr. Green, no. Ms. DeGette? No. Ms. DeGette, no. Mrs. Capps? No. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle? Ms. Harmon? No. Ms. Harmon, no. Ms. Schakowsky? No. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez? No. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee? No. Mr. Inslee votes no. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Weiner? Mr. Matheson? Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill votes aye. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen? Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut? Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, no. Mr. Space? Mr. Space, aye. Mr. McNerney? Ms. Sutton? Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Welch? No. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Upton? Mr. Stearns? Mr. Deal? Mr. Deal votes aye. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Shattuck votes aye. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Boyer? Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono Mack? Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Terry? Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mrs. Myrick? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania? Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania votes aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn? Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scouts, here.
Any member wish to respond to the vote? Roll call that has not yet responded.
Mr. Ross? Aye. Mr. Ross votes aye.
Any further votes? If not, the clerk will tally the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeas were 13 and the nays were 20. I'm sorry, the yeas were 13 and the nays were 26.
13 ayes, 26 noes. The amendment is not agreed to.
14 ayes, 26.
14 ayes, 26 noes. The amendment is not agreed to.